Hi everyone, welcome to another jsPsych plugin. Today I'm going to be talking about how to create a new plugin from scratch. This is what you'll need to do if the plugins that exist don't serve the needs that you have for your particular experiment. So the task that I'm going to be working on today is a self-paced reading task with a moving window. So that looks like this when it's all done. I'm just going to refresh the page to reset it. So I can read a word on the screen, and the other words are, there's dashes to represent where the letters would be. And if I press the space bar, it advances to the next word in the sequence. And then when the trial is finished, it's going to store the data, which is the response time for each word in the sequence, and also the sentence that I was reading. Now you actually could complete this plugin with the existing plugins, because what you could do is you could use the HTML keyboard response plugin, and you could just use a sequence of, in this case, 5 trials, where each trial was showing the stimulus that had the dashes in place of the words. And if you showed those in sequence with no gap between them, from the perspective of the subject, it would actually look, I think, identical. The main advantage of putting this into a plugin is that if you were going to use this task a lot, then this would be the kind of thing that you would want to abstract into a plugin to make it much simpler to create that set of trials. So for example, rather than having to write out a bunch of trials for every single word that you want to present, you might be able to specify a single trial that has a sentence and maybe a couple parameters about which key to use, and that would be a much simpler kind of way to program. So sometimes even when the existing plugins do the thing you want to do, you'll still want to create a new plugin to sort of get the right level of abstraction for your particular experiment. All right, so let's jump into this. I'm gonna open up a folder. So I've created a folder on my desktop. I've called it creating a plugin. And the only thing that I've done so far is load in the latest version of jsPsych, which at the time of recording is 6.1.0. Okay. So I'm going to open up this folder in my editor in VS Code. And in the plugins folder, which I can navigate to in VS Code here, but I could also do it, let me go back. I could also do it here. So in the jsPsych folder, in plugins, there's a template folder. And this has a jsPsych plugin template, which is kind of like a minimal template example. So that's the file that I'm going to actually copy. I'm just going to make a copy of that file. And I'm just going to put it right in the root directory of my project. So paste. And so here's the template file. And just to show you where I stuck it, if I go back to my project, it is right here in the root directory. Plugins do not have to be in the plugins folder. That's just by convention where all of them are put. But sometimes when I create a new plugin, I don't stick it in the plugins folder. I stick it somewhere else just because it's not part of the distribution of jsPsych. So for me, it's a little bit easier to track this way. But you could put it in the plugins folder if you wanted to. So I'm going to just do a quick rename of this file. And I'm going to call my plugin moving window. And the first thing that you might want to do when you create a new plugin is replace the name right here. This name right here is the name that controls when you use the type. When you're creating a new trial in jsPsych and you say, type HTML keyboard response or something like that, this is the thing that's most important to match. So I'm just going to go ahead and change this to moving-window. And then I'm going to change this plugin.info to be moving-window as well. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And just for a quick overview of the plugin architecture, what are we looking at here? So there's 2 components to the plugin file. There's the plugin.info, which is this first set of code. And then there's the plugin.trial, which is the second set. The rest of it, this piece down here and this part up here, is just like a programming pattern in JavaScript to create these modular files that exist. So this part and this part down here are probably not things that you'll ever have to worry about modifying. If you want to create a new plugin, it's really the .info and the .trial methods that are the important things. .info is just that. It's information about the plugin. It's used in a couple ways within jsPsych. and it was actually put in place when we were working on a graphical experiment builder. We wanted plugin files to be readable so that the graphical experiment builder could present like a menu to control the parameters of a plugin. So these type parameters, that's why they exist. And that graphical experiment builder doesn't exist yet. It's not done. So these type parameters aren't crucial, but there are a couple ways that they are used by the library, particularly with functions. So if it's a good idea to just try to set this to the right value, although if you don't, it probably won't matter in most cases. And so this parameters object is just a list of all the parameters in your plugin. One place that it does really matter is if you have default values for your parameters, then those do need to be specified here. So let's go ahead and make the parameters for this moving window self-paced reading plugin. So we're just going to do 2 parameters to keep it simple. The first is going to be the sentence that's going to be presented. I'm just going to call that words. So I'm going to replace this parameter name with the actual parameter name. So that's words. And the parameter type here is going to be a string. Okay. The default value for this we're going to leave as undefined because it doesn't really make sense to have a default set of words. So if you set something as undefined, then jsPsych will throw a warning or actually an error when somebody tries to run a trial without defining this parameter. So this parameter, by leaving it as undefined, means that you must specify it as the programmer. The other parameter that we're going to include is a parameter that I'm going to call key, and this will be the key code that a participant has to press in order to advance the trial. So the type here is key code. That's the best match. And the default, we can put a default value in here. We'll use 32, which is the space bar. If you don't know what the key codes are, and I only happen to know a couple of them, including spacebar, you can find many websites that will let you convert from pressing a key on the keyboard to the JavaScript key code. Okay, so we've got our 2 parameters. Now we're kind of done with the plugin.info for this particular plugin because there aren't that many trials there aren't that many parameters that we're worried about. The next major piece of a plugin is the .trial method. So this is the function that jsPsych runs when you are going to launch a new trial. It has 2 arguments. So the first argument is the display element. This is the element on the HTML page that jsPsych is running the experiment in. So what you're allowed to do in the plugin, or what you're encouraged to do in the plugin, is modify the display by modifying properties of the display element. And I'll show you how to do that shortly. The second argument is the trial here. And this is where you get all the parameters that are being passed in. So when you write jsPsych code and you write a particular trial and it's got some parameters, those parameters are passed to this method here through this trial object. So in our case, we should expect to have trial.words be the string, and we should expect to have trial.key be the key. And note that if a parameter has a default value and the user doesn't specify it, that value will still exist here. So trial.key will still exist even if the user doesn't specify trial.key because we've assigned a default value. Okay, inside the plugin.trial method here, there's really only one thing that you have to do. And the one thing that you have to do is call jsPsych.finished_trial at some point. And this is what tells jsPsych that this plugin is done and it can move on to the next plugin in the timeline. When you call finished trial, if you have any data that you would like to record for that plugin, you should pass that data in as the argument to finished trial. So what I would recommend doing is creating an object called trial data, and it can have a variety of parameter names with parameter values, and then you just pass that object in. And you can modify this object by adding parameters to it or changing the value of parameters throughout the trial, and then pass that object in at the end. Okay. So let's start by, let's try to do some simple modification of the display, and we'll then call finish trial to wrap up. So let's one thing that we can do inside these plugin.trial methods, and this is just a general JavaScript thing, is that you can actually declare functions within other functions. And then those functions that you declare inside another function, they only operate in the scope of that function. So this can be useful when you're setting up a trial in a plugin, because you can write functions inside of here that you use to control the progress of your trial. So let's go ahead and make a function that we just call show stimulus. And for now, we'll give it no arguments. And all this function is going to do is update the display so that we see the words that we are supposed to be showing on the screen. Excuse me. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the way to control the display is through this display element argument that's passed in. And this display element variable here, this is an HTML DOM element. So you can do all the things that you would normally do to an HTML DOM element in JavaScript. So if you're familiar with some JavaScript, you might have seen something like this, where you do like document, query selector, and you get a particular, like say, div element on the page. And then you can do things here like change the inner HTML. Think of this display element as just the result of making a query like this. So what that means is that if we want to say overwrite the display and put something new on there, we can do display element dot inner HTML equals whatever we want. So let's put a little bit of HTML around our words, and we can do a paragraph tag. We can say trial.words, and this will give us the parameter that somebody's created, and we'll end the paragraph tag. And this will display the element on the screen. And then let's go ahead and we will use this function. We'll call show stimulus, and we'll go ahead and call finish trial. Let's also go ahead while we're at it, and we can change some of this trial data so that one of the things we might clearly want to store are the words that are being presented. So we can do words is trial.words. Okay, so now we'll record a little bit of data like this. Now we still need to make an experiment that actually uses the plugin, so let's try to do that pretty quick. I'm going to do demo.html. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this as quick as I can. So this is the normal sort of setting up a JSPsych thing. If this is new to you, then definitely go back and complete some of the earlier tutorials. So I'm going to load JSPsych. I'm going to load my new plugin file. So that's right there. And I'm also going to load the CSS. Style sheet, href, CSS, JSPsych. Okay. Create a body and create a script. Okay. And let's just go ahead. We'll make a timeline. We'll make a trial. We'll do type moving window. And the parameter that we have to declare is words. So let's do something like the dog chased the car. Okay. And let's add that trial to the timeline. And we will initialize the experiment. And then just to show the data on the screen, we could actually, you know what, we'll come back to that. Let's save this for now. Okay, so if I go ahead and open this, we get the plugin. So the plugin shows the words on the screen. Now, a kind of weird thing about this plugin, so the reason, let me show you for really quick. I'm going to go back to this. If I add an on finish here, so when the experiment is done, just do the sort of one of those normal things of displaying the data on the screen. For debugging purposes. If I launch this, what's going to happen is that the data are going to show up immediately. And the reason that the data show up immediately is that inside the plugin file, there is no there's no pause between this. So we show the stimulus and then we finish the trial. And as soon as we finish the trial, jsPsych thinks, oh, the experiment is done. Let me show the data on the screen. So this plugin sort of immediately ends as soon as it begins. So the logical thing to do next would be to have some kind of keyboard response that we are waiting for. And since we're always going to want to, in this particular plugin, we're always going to want to pair a keyboard response with the stimulus being displayed, it would make sense to include that keyboard response inside this show stimulus function. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now, jsPsych has a few functions that are built into it to help with some common tasks that you might do while you're developing a plugin. And one of those common tasks is to listen for a keyboard response and record the reaction time and things like that. So there's already a built-in function. I know the function name, but I never remember all the properties off the top of my head. So this is a case where it's useful to be able to go into the other plugin files and find one that has a keyboard response and just to borrow some code from it. So I'm going to go ahead and open the HTML keyboard response plugin. And you can see here, with the HTML keyboard response, there's a much longer list of parameters. And then here's the trial method. And right here is the this function called jspsych.pluginapi.getKeyboardResponse. And this is what we want. So I'm just going to copy that. And I'm going to put it right here. We don't actually need to do anything here where we remember this keyboard response. This is useful in cases where if you're going to have that keyboard response be listening to multiple keys, then eventually you'll have to turn it off, like when your plugin ends. But we're just going to capture one key at a time. So we're just going to get rid of that. We can do for a single key, this is fine. So here's a breakdown of what's happening inside this get keyboard response method. So there are 5 arguments that are being passed in. The first and sort of the most critical is the callback function. So basically, what should we do after we detect a keyboard response? Well, we're going to call this function after response. Where's that function? Well, we don't have it yet. We have to create it. So we'll do that in a second. Second is this valid responses option. So what keys are we listening to? Which ones are we allowed to press? Well, if we copy this over from the HTML keyboard response, which has this choices parameter, but we have this single key parameter here. So we have to say trial.key. But importantly, this is expecting an array. So we have to put this inside an array. So we're going to say an array with one item, trial.key. Which response time method do you want to use? The only time that this is relevant is if you're measuring response times relative to audio stimuli. And then there is a different method that you can use that will sync up the response time with the audio. But otherwise, you just use performance. And this is called performance because it uses the performance.now function to measure the response time. Okay, persist. So do you want to listen to one key, or do you want to listen to do you want the keyboard listener to stop after you get one key, or do you want it to persist and listen to all the keys that are pressed? Here we just want a single key. We just want one time. So we're going to say false. And then finally, allow held key. So in JavaScript, by default, if you hold down a key, it'll fire a key down event repeatedly. It'll just say, yep, you're pressing the key, you're pressing the key, you're pressing the key, you're pressing the key. And then you'll end up getting like lots and lots of response times. So the get keyboard response has a check that's built in so that, say somebody presses like the J key on one trial and the screen advances, and the next trial also has the option to press J, it won't register a J being pressed again because you're holding down the key. It'll make you release the key and then press it down again before it'll register it as a new response. So that's probably a good idea for this plugin too. Otherwise, you could just kind of hold down the space bar or whatever the key is to get through the entire string. We don't want that. Okay, so this is now set up the way we want it to be set up. We have the element displaying on the screen, and we're going to get a keyboard response in return. And now we just need to do something with this after response method. So we can go ahead and create a new function called after response. And what do we want that function to do? Well, we want to record the response time. That's definitely one thing we want to do. So let's, and in this case, there's going to be multiple response times eventually, right? We're gonna have a response time for every word in the sequence. So let's go ahead and at the top of the plugin, let's create a variable and we'll just call it RT, and we'll make it an empty array. And every time we get a new response time, we'll just add the response time onto the array. So how do we access the response time in this after response? Well, there's an argument that gets passed here, and we can call it whatever we want. Let's call it response info. And response info contains the key that was pressed, and it also contains the response time of that key. So we can do rt.push response info.rt. So this will be the response time of the key, and this will add it on to the array that we created up here. And then after the response, for now, after the response, the only thing we need to do is end the trial, which we could do by calling this jsPsych.finished_trial method. Let's do one more thing though. Let's go ahead and let's make a function called endTrial. And let's go ahead and write that here, function endTrial. And for now, we can just copy this into there. But eventually there's going to be other things that we might want to do. In fact, there's one thing we want to do now, which is that we haven't added this response time to the trial data. So let's go ahead and do that inside the end trial. So we can say trial data.rt equals, and we could say .rt or just rt here, sorry. The problem is that would store it as an array inside JSPsych's data. And the best practice, at least in the current version of JSPsych, is to not store things as arrays or objects inside the JSPsych data. You should only use sort of primitive variable types. So what's recommended is that you convert any arrays or objects to JSON representation. So this is a string-based representation of the data file. So the function to do that is json.stringify, and then we'll wrap the RT. Okay, so we've got some data, and we call finish trial. So what should happen when we run this is that we'll create these data objects. We have a function for showing the stimulus. We create a function for after responding, and we have this function for ending the trial. And then finally we execute the command to show the stimulus, which will run this. After we get the keyboard response, we will run this, and that will record our response time, and it'll end the trial, which we'll call finish trial, and then we'll get out of it. So we'll be done. All right, so let me save, and let me go back to the demo. I'm going to refresh. All right, so notice that the thing that does not happen is that we don't immediately jump to the data. And I'm going to try pressing a couple keys that are not the space bar. So I'm pressing different keys, nothing's happening. Now I press the space bar, and we jump. Okay, and so you can see here we have the record of the response time. It took me 12 seconds or so to talk about that. So good, we're in pretty good shape now. So the next thing that we'll want to do in this plugin to make it this sort of useful moving window type thing is actually change it so that the stimulus that we're displaying is that sort of set of items. All right, excuse me. All right, let me get set up to do that. So let's go ahead, maybe at the very top here, let's write a function that's going to help us create these moving window stimuli. Because what we need to do is we need to be able to say what word are we on right now, and then we need to take that string of words and we need to make all the words that we're not on have dashes or something like that to blank them out. So I'm going to write a function called create moving window. And I'm going to give it two arguments here. I'm going to give it the words argument, which is going to be the string that we're passing through. And I'm also going to give it a position argument. So this is going to be which position in the sentence are we at right now. Okay, so the words that we're passing into this, that's a string right now. And it's going to be a little bit difficult to work directly with the string. So it's probably in our interest to convert that string into an array where each element of the array is a different word in the sentence. Now we could tell the user of the plugin that they need to pass in the sentence as an array. So it could be that for every sentence you need to, instead of passing in the dog chased the car, you have to pass in an array where the first element is the, and the second element is dog, and so on. And that would be fine. Like we could write that. It would make our job implementing the plugin a little easier. But in the long term, it's probably simpler to have the interface to the plugin be pass in a sentence and to do the hard work of manipulating that sentence inside the plugin. So we kind of do it once in the plugin and we don't have to do it outside in jsPsych anymore. That's a really advantage, for example, of creating this plugin in the first place instead of using a bunch of HTML keyboard response trials to do it. So I'm going to use a method. Let's see. I'm going to make a variable called word list, and I'm going to take the words. And there's a function for strings in JavaScript called split. And this you can give it a character, and it'll convert a string into an array with every time it detects the split character. And here we're just going to use space. So it'll get rid of all the spaces, and it'll convert each of those into a string or into an array. It'll take the string and convert it into an array. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to apply a function to our array that takes every element of the array that we're not at and converts it into a set of dashes, but it leaves the critical word alone. So there's a lot of ways you could do this. You could use like a for loop. You could write some kind of, a for loop is the one that comes to mind as sort of the obvious case. Other than the one I'm going to do, which is I'm going to use the map function. So let me sort of set this up. So I'm going to do wordlist.map. If you're not familiar with map, what map does is it takes a function, that's what I'm going to write inside these parentheses, and it applies that function to every element of the array that you're mapping. And then it returns that new array with the function has been applied to as the output here. So I'm going to do stimulus is wordlist.map. I'm going to write a function here. And that function can have a few different arguments. So the first argument is going to be the element of the array. And I'm going to call that word because it's going to be one word at a time. And then the second argument that will get passed is the current position that we're at. And since I've already named position up here, I'll call it index down here. So for the first element, index will be 0. For the second element of the array, it'll be 1, and so on and so forth. So this gives us a pretty straightforward way to do this. We can say if the index is equal to the position, that is, we're looking at word in position 0, then we just return that word because we just want to leave it alone. But otherwise, we want to return a string that's got the characters replaced with a bunch of dashes. And there's other ways to do this as well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a string of a dash. And then there's a nice method called repeat, which will repeat that, will sort of make that string, however long you want it to make it, number of copies. And we will do word.length. So however long the string is, repeat this thing that number of times. Okay. And then the last thing that we need to do here is we need to take this array, which is now, because of this mapping function that we applied, this array now has only one word and everything else is dashed out. And we need to combine that back into a string. And luckily, there's a really simple JavaScript method for that as well. It's called join, and we can just add that on right at the end here. So after we map, then we join it back together, and in between every element of the array, we'll put a space. So that's what this argument is here. And then finally, we just have to return this value back out. So we'll return stimulus. Okay, so now we have this nice function that will take a word and a position, and it'll create the moving window string that we're looking for. All right, so now we want to use this. So we we'll need to do a couple things. One thing is that we need to keep track of where we are in the list. So let's make a variable up here. We'll call it current position, and we'll set it equal to 0 because that's where we'll start. So our current position when we start the trial will be 0. And let's add an argument to our showStimulus method called position. And we can take this trial.words that we were using before, and we can pass it through our create moving window function. So we'll, instead of just showing trial.words, we'll show the result of passing it through the moving window. And we will pass in the words, and we will pass in the position. Okay. And so now, let's see. We've got current position. We've got this. Now we need to update the current position after every word is shown. So that we can do in this after response method here. So we can record the response time. That's good. And then we can say current position plus plus, or that adds 1 to the current position. And then we can say, how do we know if we're done? So we can say if the current position is equal to the number of words. So that we need a variable to keep track of that. We kind of have a way to do it right here. We split out those words into array. So let's just make another variable up here. So we can do the number of words is words.split with the space dot length. Okay, so now we know how many words there are. So if the current position equals the number of words, then we're done. So then we call end trial. Otherwise, we're not done. We need to show the stimulus again. We need to update the stimulus. So what we can do is we can call showStimulus, and we'll do current position. Okay, so just to rehash really quick, after a response is given, we record the response time associated with that response. We update the current position, so we move one more word in the sequence. And then we check, are we sort of at the end of the list of words? And if we are, we end the trial. And otherwise, we just show another trial. We call this method again, but now position is 1 more, and the stimulus will look a little different. So let's go ahead and save that. And let's go back to the demo. I'm going to refresh this. Oh, I have an error. So let me open up the console. What did I do wrong? Words is not defined. Line 31. So let's see. Yeah, right here. So no, not here. Right here. So in the function, words was defined because we passed it in as a variable name. Out here, it's trial.words because it's part of the trial object that's being passed in. So let me save that. Hopefully that fixes my error. Okay. Sort of fixed it, except the word doesn't show up. Oh, it okay. It shows up for the last set, but not the first one. So why is that? What did I do wrong? Let's see. Current position is 0. Did I do this wrong? That seems fine. All right, let's debug. Let's debug in here. So we can open up the plugin file. So if you haven't done this before, this is a useful thing to look at. So you can open up the developer tools, and you can open up the plugin file, and then you can put breakpoints in. So I'm just going to click on line 34, sort of the first line inside my create moving window function. And okay, so let's see what's happening here. So we can hover over variables to see. So the words, the dog chased the car, that looks good. Position is undefined. Okay, so that must be the problem. Why is position undefined? Because the first time that we call the show stimulus, I forgot to pass in the position. All right, simple problem that the debugger can help us find. So let me go back. And then of course it works the other times because this first time we're doing it, we're not in the response method, but then every other time we do it, we are in it right there. Okay, so we can just put current position in here as well. All right, I think that's going to solve the problem. Let's refresh, take away the breakpoint so that it runs. There we go. Dog chased the car. All right, so great. We're really close. The one thing that I think is a problem right now is that you'll notice that because of the way that fonts work, right? This is not a font where every character takes up the same amount of space. These dashes take up less space than, say, the capital letter. So you can see that the words kind of shift around as they're presented. But we can fix that through some CSS. We can control CSS in our plugin. So let's go back to here. And let's go to, let's see, the stimulus. So here's the stimulus that we're creating. We could, one way to do this would be to add some style directly to the stimulus element. So we can say style, we can do font family is monospace. So this will use any monospace font that's on the user's computer, and it will display that in a monospace font. A monospace font is just a kind of font where every character is the same width. So some common monospace fonts are things like Courier, Courier New, or lots of fonts that end in mono as a phrase. So we can do that. Let's go back to the plugin, refresh. And now the plugin looks much smoother because the width is fixed throughout the entire trial and does what we want it to do. We could also, we could change the size too. We could make it by default. We could make it a little bit bigger. Say like font size 28 pixels, something like that. Note too, by the way, that this font size option here, right? This would be a very logical thing to take out of the code itself and turn it into a parameter. So you could, of course, construct this by removing this 28 and moving it up as like a font size parameter, and then using the variable trial.font size as a way of controlling that. I'm not going to show that here, just to keep this on the shorter side, hopefully. And but that's the kind of thing that you can do as you're developing a plugin. Anytime you find a parameter that you're hard coding in, it's probably a good idea to pull that out and put it in the parameters list. All right, so let me go back. We made it a little bigger. There we go. Dog chased the car. Good. All right. So I think the last thing to talk about really quick is just some good plugin hygiene. So I want to show you one thing by changing our demo file. I'm going to not show the data at the end here, just to make a point. So by not showing the data at the end, let's see what happens if our plugin continues indefinitely. I'm going to refresh. So the dog chased the car, and I'm going to hit spacebar, hit it. I just hit it. But notice that nothing changes. The plugin, the trial has actually ended. The experiment has ended, but the content is still on the screen. And that's because you, as a plugin writer, you have to sort of take down everything that you did when you construct a plugin. And what do I mean by that? I mean, like, clear the display, get rid of all the stuff that you put on there. JSPsych doesn't do this by default. It's a change that we're considering for a future version. So maybe by the time you're watching this, this will actually be unnecessary. But the design idea, at least initially, was there might be a situation, a rare situation, in which you want a plugin to actually make some sort of persistent change to the display. And I don't know if that's actually true. I don't think there are any plugins that do that now, but at the time that was the thinking. So one common thing that you'll see for example, if you open up another plugin file and you go to, there's often like an end trial method. So here's the end trial method for the HTML keyboard response plugin. There's a few things that often happen. So if you're using like set timeout methods to control timing, there's this clear all timeouts message that often happens. There's a method to cancel any persistent keyboard listeners that happen. And then this big one here, which is the one that we need to add to our trial, to clear the display, to set the inner HTML of the display to a blank string. So we can just copy that and we can stick it right here. Okay, and then let's run our demo one more time. So I'll refresh. The dog chased the car. All right, so now our experiment is over, but the data aren't displaying because we commented that out. And then finally, I will just show you last time. If we take this back out, run it one more time, the data come back. So that's what we want to do. All right, so hopefully that is a useful introduction to creating a plugin from scratch. I think the key point to take away from this is that you can do pretty much anything you want inside this plugin.trial method. If there's anything that you can do in HTML, whether that be, you know, sound, video, lots of different kinds of interaction, right? Literally like creating a small video game that plays inside. You can do all of that inside here. You can use external libraries. So if you want to like render scalable vector graphics, SVG files, or like control an animation through that, you can import other libraries and use those libraries inside this function, just as you would any other JavaScript code. So really anything you can do in JavaScript, you can do inside this plugin.trial method. And then just to finish, what I'll say is that, you know, if I'm designing something that's relatively complicated, a new plugin that's relatively complicated, the way that I often approach that is I'll often create an HTML file with some JavaScript that actually doesn't use jsPsych at first. What I try to do is create an HTML page with JavaScript that acts like a single trial. And then I'll get that page working without all of the sort of overhead of working within the jsPsych, just to get like the interface, right? If I'm creating like a complicated interface with, say, you know, certain kinds of animations and different kinds of buttons or something like that, or a game or whatever it is, it can be a little bit cumbersome to have to sort of modify the display element in this way. It might be easier to just like type some HTML in and see if it renders in the way that you expect it to. So what I will do is I'll often do that. I'll create a page with the JavaScript, get the interaction working, and then I'll sort of translate that into plugin code by using this display element to modify the display rather than sort of directly modifying the display myself. So that's just a tip for how to approach plugin development when you're doing something complicated. But if you're doing something like this, where you're sort of doing minimal modifications to the display, you can just sort of jump right in and you can create a plugin file and create a little simple experiment that uses that plugin, and you're good to go. So hope you get to create lots of fun and interesting plugins, and please share them when you do, because as you develop plugins, there are definitely going to be other people out there who are interested in using them. All right, take care.